Today I'm speaking with Brad Onishi. Brad, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And you are a doctor, but you've given me the permission to call you Brad, so thank you for that. And Brad co-hosts the Straight White American Jesus podcast. He has been extensively published, including the book Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. He is the an adjunct professor at the University of San Francisco. He holds an undergrad degree from Azusa Pacific University, and he also has a degree from Oxford University. With his podcast, he co-hosts that with Daniel Miller, and I'll have the links for their podcast and his website below this video, so please check them out and like and subscribe and all that. But at this point, Brad, before we get into your story, we'd love to just hear more about you.
Yeah, so as you said, I kind of straddle two worlds. I have a PhD in religious studies. Most of my life is spent studying religion in some way. I've done that as somebody who's taught all over the country, but I'm also a secular person. I don't identify as religious, and so I'm thoroughly kind of embedded in conversations about atheism and secular folks in the United States, and I've spoken at the American Atheist Convention and Freedom from Religion. So I kind of feel like somebody who's in two different worlds at once, and always trying to have conversations in both.
Interesting. Can you tell us something fun or quirky about yourself, any of your hobbies?
Sure. I'm a native Californian. My dad's from Hawaii, so I grew up surfing, which is like something that's still important to me. The older I get, the worse I get at it, and the uglier I think I probably do it. But it's still super fun for me, and it ticks three boxes. I'm in nature, I'm alone, and I'm exercising, and those three things are pretty hard to do when you have young kids and busy schedules. So that's something I still love to do. Yeah.
How many children do you have?
So we have a 2-year-old, and then my wife is due in 2 weeks. So we are getting ready for number 2. So
Wow.
it's all we're in the middle of it.
Well, congrats in advance. I'm glad I got a chance to talk to you. I'm sure you're going to be busy after this one.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I was going to say I'm also jealous of you living near the Pacific Redwoods. That's really cool. I'd love to get out there someday. Hmm.
Yeah, so I live in the Bay Area, and it's everything people think it is. It's expensive and it's crowded and all that stuff. But a benefit is I live about 20 minutes from the redwoods, and love to hike. And the redwoods are so soothing. It feels like you're in a canopy of just forest, and it's pretty awesome. And so anyway, if you ever have a chance, get out here, and I'll show you around.
Thank you very much. Well, we love to hear people's stories. I know your story is very different in some ways because I often interview people who grew up in a home where they were taught about Christ from the earliest days. The whole get them while they're young concept. But yours is a little different. But we'd love to still hear where you came from and how you got involved with Christianity and where it evolved from there.
Yeah, it's it's interesting to think about the earliest days for me. So my dad, as I said, Japanese American guy from Maui. My mom's a white woman from Tennessee, and they met in California and got married. So they had this interracial marriage that, back in the 80s was still somewhat rare to see an Asian man and a white woman on the street together. Both, I think, of their families took some time to adjust to them being together. And one of the weird things, though, is that I grew up in Southern California. A lot of people think that's a place that's, very liberal and very whatever. But where I grew up in Orange County, it was actually very conservative politically, and there was a lot of Christianity imbued. I mean, in a way that you would expect in the South, maybe in the Midwest. I've lived in the South. I've lived in Tennessee and Virginia. And, in those places, you get asked at the grocery store, and I know you know this, hey, what church do you go to? And God bless you and all that business. Where I grew up was a little bit similar to that. And so I remember being 8, 9, 10 years old and really having very little exposure to organized religion. But I'd had enough that, like, I remember at times praying, like if something went bad, I would pray to this God that I didn't know about really. And I guess I just kind of had understood that if you need help, you ask God. There was enough Christianity around me that, like, if something bad was happening, or I was going to get an F on a test, or like we were going to lose our big soccer game or something, I would pray. And it's weird to think about that because I think that was a direct influence of growing up around so many Christian people who really made Christianity the dominant ethos of where I grew up. So at age 14, I'm kind of getting in trouble. I'm getting suspended from school, and I've totally entered the grunge era. It was 1995. I was like, I thought Kurt Cobain and Nirvana and Pearl Jam and those guys were like they were the best thing in the world. sex, drugs, rock and roll, kind of early teenage stuff. And I had a girlfriend invite me to this church on a Wednesday night. And I'm not going to lie, in my head, I'm like, look, it's hard to get mom to let me go out at night on the weekdays. It's impossible to let me out of the house on a weekday because I want to go see my girlfriend. So that there's no way if I say, hey, it's Wednesday, mom, I'm going to go to my girlfriend's house, that she'll say yes. That's not going to happen. But she will say yes if I want to go to church, because I think in her mind, it's going to be like, well, maybe that'll set him straight and he'll quit acting out and being a little punk. And so she said yes. And I thought, great. Now, stage 2 of the plan is get to this church, find girlfriend, and we'll sneak out of the Bible study and go make out. That was like my master idea for this Wednesday. I get to the church, and it's a fairly big church. It's a church of about 2,000 people. And, there's a big youth group with 50, 60, 70 kids my age. And there's these young leaders who welcome me as soon as I get there. They have tattoos and they play guitars and they're cool. And they're not the like old stuffy Christians I imagined I was going to meet. I thought I was going to meet Ned Flanders and just be like, these guys are so lame. So I meet these guys who are 20, 22, 24, and they're like, hey, my hair's like pink at the time. They're like, cool hair. And I'm like, oh, okay. I thought you were going to tell me, God hated my hair or something. Long story short, I really got hooked that night. And one of the reasons I got hooked is because I just found it was a welcoming community that I thought, oh, these guys are nice and it's kind of fun to hang out here. The second reason, though, and I think this might appeal to some of the free thinkers and humanists and others who are listening, is, I was a kid who really contemplated big questions a lot. And that sounds weird, but, kind of foreshadowed a life as a professor, somebody who just sits around and thinks a lot about big questions. And I would lay in my driveway as a kid, face up, looking at the stars, on warm nights, and just ask myself, like, why are we here? And I remember doing that at age like 13 and thinking like, all right, like, you get older, like, and then you get a job and then you get kids and then you die. I guess that's life. I don't know. That seems lame. And I was a kind of on a path of wondering what's the meaning of life. And it really kind of gnawed at me, because I thought, all right, what are you supposed to do? I'm surrounded by this kind of middle-class suburban life. Everyone I know just sort of grows up. They get a job like my dad. They go to that job. They come home on the weekends. We like go see Nana, and we, sometimes we go to the beach or we play soccer or something. That's fun. But then you die. This is not enough. Those existential questions came with me when I went to church on that Wednesday night. And what I found at church were people who had answers to all of my existential questions. And the answers were really quick and tidy. You pray this way, you're forgiven. You relate to God this way, you get to live forever. You do this, you have a community of people who love you, and they will support you as you go along in this journey to serve God. And all of a sudden, this checklist of existential angst starts to get ticked off, right? I mean, every box is like getting pinged, and I'm like, wow. So you're telling me I can come hang out with these cool young leader guys at this youth group, and then you're also going to answer every existential question I have, and you're going to do it in a way that's so quick. I don't have to do any long division. I don't have to do any like weird equations. I don't have to read 78 books. I don't have to go through a path of wisdom that takes years to understand. You're telling me right here and right now, I have access to answers to life's most fundamental questions. All right, I'm going to sign up. And that's what I did. The girl that invited me to church dumped me pretty soon after that. But church was like my second home. I just wanted to be there all the time. I wanted to be there on Wednesday night and Sunday, and really just ingest everything I could. I started reading the Bible. I started reading all these Bible study kind of supplemental aids. I started studying all the books that these leaders gave me. And I was just like, all of a sudden, this was my thing. And I very quickly told my friends, these folks I'd known for a long time that I was getting in trouble with, like, hey, I'm not going to do this stuff anymore. No more shoplifting, no more making out behind the movie theater, no more cigarettes, and, whatever else we got up to as little bandits running around the neighborhood, because I'm with Jesus now, and they all looked at me like, rolled eyes, like, whatever, buddy. But I stuck to it, and I became very extreme, and I'm happy to talk more about how I got to be a very extreme person with my faith. But yeah, that's the outline of kind of the early years.
What was there a gospel presentation at some point where you clearly understood, like, not just that church was cool and that there were questions being answered, but that you actually could have a relationship with God? And like, what was that like?
Totally. So this was eighth grade, and basically in May of my eighth grade year, there was a one night kind of retreat with the church youth group, and we went up to Malibu to a campground, and it was only eighth graders. So as everybody I knew, they were all in my grade, and I kind of knew everybody that was there. And we set up tents and did the whole thing. But at night, we had this time where there was a devotional and a Bible study, and we sang worship songs. And so here we are sitting around the fire at a beach campground. I'm with a bunch of these kids I know from school. And, basically everyone is talking about giving their life to God and serving God. And especially when we go to high school, which is going to be this whole new kind of adventure and challenge and stage of life. And that's the moment where I thought, okay, I don't know what it takes to serve God. I don't know all the details. I don't know all the things I have to give up and all the ways that I have to change my life, but I'm going to do it because this is worth it. All my questions are answered. I'm going to get eternal life. I'm going to get God's love and forgiveness. And I get to hang out in this community and do all these things with these people. Let's do it. I'm good. And that's when I told myself, I don't care what you have to do. Let's change our life in order to serve God. So that's, I went back to my old friends and said, I'm not going to kiss a girl until we get married. That was my next big announcement. And, I said, no more cussing and no more, any of that business, because I'm now a full-throated, like, on board Jesus freak. And it is my whole identity. And so after that one night, and you all can imagine it. Many of you have been through it. Someone's playing a guitar, everyone's kind of hugging and praying and worshiping God and singing songs. And, it's very emotional, and it tugs on your pathos. And so it's one of those times, and you're also looking forward to high school, and you're kind of afraid of what's next. And so this was a nice way to, like, grab onto something that felt very safe and very like it would be a guide and a North Star. And so that was a big, big moment. And when I became, this is skipping ahead, but I eventually became a youth pastor, and I would take kids back to that same campground because it meant so much to me as a kind of place where I gave my life to God.
That's amazing. I just wanted to go back for 1 second. I know your parents weren't really raising you as a Christian. Could you just give us a little background of what their background was religiously, and how did they respond to your conversion?
Yeah. So my mom was, is a Southern woman who grew up with God and country, like many folks still do, but especially in her generation. So I think she always felt guilty that she wasn't in church like many people in the South do. And so when I converted, I think she was pretty happy. Like, okay, this is good. And I think she was especially happy because this meant an influence in my life that would prevent me from getting in so much trouble and just sort of being all over the place. So for the most part, Mom was on board. Dad was a different story. My dad grew up in Hawaii. The community and school that he grew up in was majority Asian American. It was majority, what we would call majority minority. The kids he went to high school with were Japanese American, Chinese American, Native Hawaiian, Filipino, and there was a few white kids, but like they were the outliers, right? And he was Buddhist. He grew up mowing the lawn at the Buddhist church. Even now, when we go back to Maui, we go to the Buddhist temple because that is where the remains of my great grandmother, my great grandfather, and other family members are. There's a whole kind of shrine to them there. So for him to have a Christian son who was just talking about Jesus all the time and carrying his Bible and all this, and it was hard for him, on a Sunday morning when he would make us pancakes and want to have family breakfast. I was like, I want to go to church. I don't want to be here. I want to go to church and see all these other people. And for him, it took him a long time to accept that. It hurt him, I think. The change in the story, happy to talk about this more, is that eventually he converted and he became part of the church and he became part of the whole thing that I was doing. So really? It was a process, and it was hard on him. Yeah. And there was times it was hard on mom. Like I'm not kidding when I say I was extreme. So you know, after I converted, at Christmas time, my mom said, "Hey, you're 15. What do you want for Christmas?" "I don't know what you want. Just tell me." And I said, Mom, I don't want you to buy any Christmas presents. I want you to send Bibles through this organization. And I had like these pamphlets in my backpack. I'm like, "Hey, here's the pamphlet. Spend that money on Bibles to send God's word to Nepal, because there's a lot of people there that have never heard the name Jesus. I don't need a Christmas present. I just want people to come to know our Lord and Savior." And she just looked at me like, "Okay, I'm going to church is one thing, buddy. This is, come on, really? This is what we're doing now? Okay." And, she was like, "All right, whatever you want." But at that point, I think she was like kind of wishing I was sneaking out of the house again and smoking pot, because things were getting a little weird. So anyway, that's part of it.
I definitely had a similar experience growing up. I was my focus was on Compassion International,
Yep.
supporting those
Yep.
kids. But yeah, it was the same way. Wanted to give everything I could. What with your growing up in, or eventually being exposed to the church there, and becoming a Christian, being on fire for the Lord, and getting into ministry. At that point, I know you married. You married a woman that was a Christian, right? At the
Oh
time.
yeah. So we
Okay.
we met when I was 14. Like right when I converted, I went to high school and I met her, and we dated all
Mm,
through high school. And then we got married after my second year in college.
that's awesome. But you both wanted to kind of serve the Lord together in
Oh
ministry.
yeah. So one of the reasons I think that we were drawn to each other, even in high school, is that she, I think we saw each other as matching each other's commitment. Like she was as committed as me. She was, on Friday nights, we would go to the movie theater in our neighborhood or in our town, and we'd stand outside the movie theater, and together we'd ask people, hey, like kids our age, "Hey, do you know Jesus? Do you know where you're going to spend eternity?" That was like our Friday night date time, right? So like we really saw each other as equally yoked, as they say, and that was a big draw. Yeah.
Mm. I was curious when you were at that point though, where you're, a Christian and you're trying to serve the Lord and do ministry, especially as a married couple. When you started to have any doubts,
Mm-hmm.
number one, just how did the doubts start? But number two, did you fear bringing those up to your spouse, and just the ramifications of what if you go too far in your slippery slope of concerns about the Christian faith?
Yeah, what happened for us was, so at age 18, I became a part-time worker at the church, a part-time intern, they called it. They paid me a little bit of money, and so I was basically starting to minister to the youth group where I had converted. When I was 20, the youth pastor at the church was fired for a number of reasons, and they basically said, "Do you want to become the full-time youth pastor?" And so now here I am. I'm 20 years old. I've done 2 years of college. I'm married, and I'm in charge of about 200 kids in a youth group. That's a lot, when you're 20. I
That's
can't even
huge.
buy a beer. I can't go order a beer at a bar. And here I am married and in charge of 200 kids and a full-time student.
Mm,
Um, so those first 2 years, we were just a powerhouse team. We were the couple that was making it happen. And I understand this now that I have kids. When you take care of people's kids, when you're good to people's children, when you help them, when you support them, especially at a moment in their life when they're vulnerable, those people love you. I mean, they will be grateful to you forever, because you're helping their like 13-year-old son or their 15-year-old daughter, and they will always. So when we got married, there were 1,000 people at the ceremony, right?
wow.
And not at the reception. I didn't pay to feed all those people, but it was all those kids from youth group, all their parents, right? And it was because they saw us as not only helping them, but as like, "Hey, kids, you should emulate these guys because they are doing it right. They're getting married, they're serving the Lord, all that." Right about 2 years later, when we graduated college, I feel like we both started to have doubts, but they were expressed differently. For her, she became a public school teacher, and she taught in a school that was underprivileged. And so a lot of her students were coming from households with little support, not a lot of economic means, predominantly kids of color, where our church was predominantly white. And her life started to change and be like, I don't really want to be ensconced in the church day in and day out. I want to be out here with these kids. I want to be like in the community with folks who really need like help and support and mentorship and everything else. So I think for her, it was like, I don't want to spend all this time in the church. I want to go out and do these things. And my teacher friends, the friends who I teach with, a lot of them aren't Christians, and a lot of them like drink beer on Friday nights and they cuss a lot, but they're good people who care a lot about these kids. That's what I want to do. Right. So for her, it was a social kind of distancing. It was like, I'm getting away from this really isolated Christian culture because of another calling on my life, which is actually to be an amazing public school teacher and coach and mentor and all that. My doubts and my concerns were growing on the intellectual front. I was entering seminary, and so I was just reading all of these things, right? I was a philosophy major in college, and then I went to seminary, and I started reading church history. And I started at the beginning, like early church fathers, 3rd and 4th century, Thomas Aquinas, Meister Eckhart, Protestant Reformation, and then all the way to the present day. And what happens, and this is a familiar story, and I don't have to tell you this, but you really start to get a bigger picture of the faith you're practicing. And you realize that the faith you're practicing is almost a historical aberration from the way that Christianity has been envisioned throughout time. And you start to ask yourself, like, wait a minute, is the way that we approach sin or the incarnation or the atonement or salvation, is that actually the way that the Bible teaches or that Christians over time have really thought about it? And my answers began to increasingly be no. Like, the way we do Christianity is like this modern American version that, in fact, I don't even like that much and is not enjoyable. There's very little joy. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of like shame. And this doesn't seem to be working anymore. So we had a marriage that I think in some ways was going along the same track. We were both kind of like, no, this isn't working anymore. The concerns were different. For her, it was social. For me, it was intellectual. And, eventually I think that helped us in our next chapter when we left the church, but it also meant, we ultimately decided to go our separate ways because I think we had different ideas of what we wanted to do with our lives.
When you are, kind of what they would say deconstructing as opposed to deconverting, you're kind of just shifting and reanalyzing what you've believed, but not necessarily actually, what I would say escaping.
Yeah.
What was it that got you to move from that point, which is, that can be scary alone, even just to say, I'm in some ways, the people that have been my people are not necessarily my people, but my people are still Christians of some kind.
Yeah.
To move past that is kind of scary. What took you a little bit further, was that a quick thing where you just studied a few things and it just kept like the ball kept moving, or were you kind of planted in what I would call progressive Christianity for a while?
Yeah. Great question. So I was in this place where 50 hours a week I'm at the church. I mean, I've never, as an adult, I've never had another job. I have no other skills really at this point than being a minister. I'm 24. A lot of my friends from high school are like starting careers and they're going to be a real estate agent or they're going to go to law school. I'm just a minister. So, and in addition, all the reading I'm doing is like, I don't think I fit here anymore. This is not my future. I'm in a very weird place where I have to go to church 50 hours a week and minister to people, talk to kids through the Bible, be a camp counselor, pray in front of the congregation on a Sunday morning in front of 2,000 people. And I'm not sure I believe in God anymore, or I think I still do believe in God, but it's certainly not the God these people believe in. So on one hand, I have to perform my function as a minister. On the other hand, I'm pretty sure that I don't believe this stuff anymore. So what I would do, and I was famous for this during this period, famous is too strong a word, but a lot of people in the community knew where to find me. Every waking moment I had, I would go to the coffee shop and I'd have like 10 books on the table, and I'd be drinking coffee and I'd be reading anything from Thomas Aquinas all the way to some book about how evangelicalism in the US, doesn't work anymore. And so intellectually, I was a progressive Christian at this point. Social justice, love and inclusion. And yet, as a minister, I was still stuck in the church. So my wife and I were like, we need to get out of here. Like, she wanted out, I wanted out. Everybody at the church wanted us to be missionaries. They wanted us to plant a church. And we were like, what's next? And so I was like, look, I want to go to grad school because I want to keep reading. I want to figure this out. I want to figure out what is I believe and what I want to do and what God is and how God works and what his plan is for the world. And she was like, okay. And she was an athlete. She was like, I want to play basketball. I want to keep playing basketball after college. I was like, okay, let's do it. So I applied to grad school all over the English speaking world. And I somehow, and if you want me to talk about it, I will, but I cajoled Oxford University into letting me in for a master's degree. Never expected that to happen. Did not feel particularly prepared for it, but it happened. So all of a sudden, I'm going from my hometown where I've never left, and we're getting on a plane and we're moving our life. We're selling our car. We're getting rid of all of our belongings, and we're moving to Oxford, England, so I can start a master's degree. This is a massive change, and I'm from Southern California. We're talking a place with no old buildings. An old house in Southern California is from the 1970s. There's no like statues from the Revolutionary War, or we don't have any of that there. And all of a sudden, I live in a town where John Locke went to school, and Duns Scotus, and where Alice in Wonderland was written. And the buildings are hundreds of years old, and the university is 1,000 years old, right? So when I get there, I'm part of a college at Oxford. Oxford has like 45 different colleges. I'm part of the only college that is Baptist. And Baptists in the UK are a little bit different than in the United States. They drink. Many of them are affirming of LGBTQ folks. Their theology is not nearly as strict as like a Southern Baptist. And that landing spot really helped me, because all of a sudden I was with Christians who were different. Some of them were gay. Many of them just had a lot different understanding of Jesus than me. And it really felt like, oh, I can finally breathe. Like I can finally breathe. I'm in a place where nobody's policing me. The senior pastor isn't worried about the books I'm reading at the coffee shop and like, yeah, what's Brad up to? I'm kind of worried about that guy. He seems like he's disgruntled. And I was away from home. And so when I went out, it was the first time in my life, my adult life, where when I went to the grocery store in my hometown, I saw 10 people I knew, right? And they all saw me as a minister. At the ball field, coffee shop, 10 people I know, I'm a minister. In Oxford, I'm nobody. I go out, nobody knows who I like went to the pub for the first time and ordered a beer. I was like so nervous to like walk up to the counter and be like, hello, I'll have 2 beers. I just felt like Satan's going to come, God's going to strike me down. Satan has entered my body. What am I doing? Yeah. That kind of feeling. So when we got there, life changed quickly because we were no longer held in by this insular community and feeling, and we could just do and be whatever we wanted. And, happy to talk more about that chapter, but that was a huge, huge step for me.
Well, could I ask, as you're at that stage and you're thinking through it all, were you in any way predicting that was it an option in your mind that this might not be actually real? Were you open to, was it just like you need to land in a healthy part of Christianity, or were you open to this might not even be my ultimate worldview?
That's what I thought. I really thought, okay, now that I'm free, I'm going to go to England, and in Oxford is the church where John Wesley himself started Methodism. I'm going to go hang out with some Methodists and talk about social justice. Maybe that's going to be my people. All right, let's do it. And then there was an Anglican congregation that met in one of the most beautiful and oldest buildings in Oxford. This just beautiful cathedral-like place. And I thought, this is new. There's like liturgy and incense, and you have to stand and you have to kneel, and that's a lot different than guitars and Hawaiian shirts at a mega church, right? I thought that's kind of cool. Let's try that. And about 2 months of trying that, I realized it's Sunday morning. You know what I really want to do right now? Sleep. I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to put on a pair of slacks. I want to sleep. It's Sunday morning. You know what I want to do? I want to wake up at like 10 a.m., make myself some coffee and eggs and bacon. I don't know, watch a movie, just be lazy. Because I had never done that as an adult since I was 14. I had never done a lazy Sunday. And as those Sundays piled up, I thought, do I actually need to go to church? Do I want to go to church? Is church something that I want to be part of my life? And then I sort of told myself, well, you know what? You had a lot going on. You just got out of ministry in a really bad sort of experience at your old church. Give it 6 months, and then we'll jump back in, and we'll be fully ensconced in a church at that point. Nah, Didn't happen. So gradually, I just started to admit to myself, hey, I'm still really into asking big questions, but I'm not sure I'm into participating in Christianity. And that's what happened. I mean, if you fast forward to a year later, I didn't even pretend. I didn't go to church, didn't even pretend like I did, and was happy about it.
Hmm. Did you fear at all that you were being deceived by the devil, or that you were deceiving yourself, and that you might be actually sort of ultimately in the big picture damning yourself by not staying strictly within Christianity?
You know, when I look back on that time, that was a moment when I think that intellectually I was fine. I had done so much reading. I was still studying theology, mind you. 8 hours a day, I read theology, liberation theology, open theology, whatever may be, process theology, feminist theology. So I was still very much into religion as like something I thought about all the time. So intellectually, I thought I was good. I wasn't afraid of the devil. I wasn't afraid of Satan or hell or any of that. I was good. My body didn't catch up so easily to my head. My body was still traumatized by all the experiences I'd had. And so when I look back on that period, I realized that my body was still putting on guardrails, right? That my body was still afraid. So like, we haven't talked about this yet, but I got divorced. My wife went back to the United States, and it was very amicable. Like, we're 24, we're not 14, we're different. We have different things we want in life. I love you, you love me, but we probably shouldn't stay married, right? We didn't have kids, and it was fine. And it hurt like hell, but it wasn't a messy, I hate you, get out of my life, never speak to me again kind of divorce. So here I am alone. I'm not married anymore. I'm no longer a minister. I'm 6,000 miles away from anyone that I know. And I'm entering a whole new phase of life. Like, I got to like go on a first date all of a sudden, or hang out with these new friends of mine who want to like go to the pub and drink beer. And hey, should we go out back and smoke a cigarette? And I'm just like, yeah, of course. Yeah, I know how to do that. Let's do things like that. And so there's all these moments in this period where my body was like, nope, like afraid, trauma reaction, anxious, like, what are you doing? Where my mind was like, you're fine. God does not care if you smoke a cigarette. God doesn't care if you have a beer at the pub. God doesn't care if you go on a first date. So it was a mismatch between intellectually being in one place and my body being in another one.
Interesting. It sounds in some ways too like you were, I would guess, spared because you weren't heavily indoctrinated as a child. It's just somewhat what I would consider the worst parts of the indoctrination, where you almost kind of grow up envisioning angels and demons fighting around you around your bed at night, trying to get you to have bad thoughts. And that's really good. I'm very glad that that wasn't part of your story. Did you, at that point though, in your journey, did you fear that like there might not be an afterlife? And how did you process the whole question of what happens when you die, or were you still grappling with that for a while?
Yeah, I think what took hold for me very quickly was like, if there is a God, that God is way more interested in a person who is going to invest his time and his life in justice, in inclusion, in peace, in creating a world that is more like the one that is described in the kingdom, in the Sermon on the Mount, rather than somebody who's preaching damnation and hell and hatred and so on. So I think I thought, I mean, and this is, I know, maybe a little bit rare in these kinds of conversations. I thought, all those folks at home probably think I'm going to go to hell at this point. I feel okay about it. I feel like I have entered a place of actually understanding what God wants, if there is a God, and I'm not even sure there is one. So I wasn't afraid necessarily of dying. What was a more dominant force in my life at this point was that, remember, there's 1,000 people at my wedding when I got married 4 or 5 years prior to this. There was a lot of people at home that are starting to get wind of my new life. They're starting to realize and get news that, hey, Brad, he's no longer an evangelical. Hey, Brad, he drinks beer now. Hey, Brad, he and his wife got divorced. So all of a sudden, I'm getting news from home that's like, what's wrong with you? Can I help you? People are asking my parents, what happened to Brad? Why did he give in to Satan's temptations? Is he an alcoholic? Is he off on the deep end or whatever? And when I'd go home to visit, I'd go to that coffee shop where I used to see 10 people I knew and shake their hand, and they'd look me in the eye, and all of a sudden they're just walking past me. right? They're ducking their head. They're hoping we don't have an awkward thing, right? Because I was persona non grata. I was like nobody to them. I was the guy that lost it. I was the big disappointment. I was the guy that really let them down, right? And so I think it was a lot of dealing with those feelings of like, there's all these kids that used to look up to me, and am I now just this huge failure because I'm not following the path that I taught them?
It's a huge burden to carry, that disappointment. I've had something very similar in my life as well. It's crazy how that works, and it's funny too, because when you expect to be doing it as like your full-time job, it's not just that you want their respect and their, the honor of that position, but they're literally going to be paying your bills.
Yeah.
They're going to be paying your paycheck for the next 30, 40 years. And it kind of puts a lump in your throat to think the shift that it can occur is so monumental.
Yeah.
Well, if you go back to my earlier question, if you just based on what you know, best guess, what do you think happens when you die?
At this point, right now,
Yeah.
like, what do I think? Oh, I have no idea. I mean, I know a lot of atheists say, well, you're dead. And that makes sense to me. You're an organ, your body's an organism. Organism no longer has breath or a heartbeat. You're gone. That makes sense. So, I'm not going to dispute that. I don't have any evidence of an afterlife. I have no evidence of anything. So I'm not somebody who has any firm belief in those things either. But I am a secular person who is willing to say, I just don't know. And I've spent my life, I'm 42. I've spent literally the last 20 years in academia thinking about questions regarding, transcendence and the meaning of all things, and studied that through various lenses, various religious traditions, atheist communities, free thinking communities, humanist communities. And so I think for me, it's just more of like, that's a mystery I will just let be. That's where I've arrived. I'm no longer a Christian who feels the need to solve that. And this might be disappointing to some folks. I'm fully aware of that, but I'm also not an atheist who feels like he needs to solve that.
Right.
It's a question that in my life is one that will remain unsolved. And it's not one that really consumes me. Because what consumes me is questions of who can I help? What matters while I'm here? Why am I alive? When I get off track and I get frustrated about things in my career or things in my home life or things in myself, the North Star I come back to now is, why are you alive? You're 40. You got, how many decades do you have left? You have 2, 3, 4, 5 decades left. What's the point of being here? And that's what I think about rather than what happens when I die.
One more quick question on that, and then I wanted to move on to something else. But do you, if you were offered the chance to live forever, if you found out you could, would you want to?
I don't even know what that would look like. I think one of the things I've concluded after studying things like the idea of a Christian heaven, the idea of a Islamic paradise, Muslim paradise, the idea of reincarnation, and also transhumanism. So I actually ended up writing my master's thesis at Oxford on transhumanism and its religious elements. And transhumanism, I know a lot of people might be familiar with it now, right? It's the idea that you might technologically upload your brain and live forever, that you might have a new body that would allow you to live, if not forever, for thousands of years, that we might be able to go to Mars with new bodies, same brain, and live forever right? So I've studied a lot of that. I've thought through that so long. And what I've tried to lead my students through now when we talk about this kind of stuff is this. It's one thing to think about a situation where instead of living to 80 or 100, humans might live to 200 or 300 years, right? That's a quantitative change. So if you said human life expectancy, 250 years, maybe you don't go to college until you're 90. I don't know. Maybe you don't get married until you're 166. I don't know. And it's really fun to do this with like college students, right? And be like, all right, you're living to 250. What are you going to do? And they have all these fun ways that they kind of configure life according to that timeline. What I tell them then is like, all right, now you're going to live forever. It's a qualitative change, right? It's an ontological change. It's a metaphysical change because now you're going to live forever, whether here or in the afterlife. What are you going to do? And one of the things I try to lead them through is like, it is almost impossible to imagine what that is like, because as human beings, we are so constituted by our mortality and our temporality that there's almost no way to think myself out of a situation where I'm a born and a dying being, right? So if you say, would you want to live forever? I don't want to live forever in the Christian sense of just like existing somewhere forever with no change and no vulnerability, no temporality. To me, that is almost like death. If you read Plato's myth of the soulmate, right? A lot of people know Aristophanes as reciting the myth of the soulmate in Plato, and that's where we get this Western idea of having another half. One of the things hidden in that myth that Aristophanes, the comedian, says in the Symposium is he's like, when you meet your soulmate and you're fully united, you'll be motionless, you'll be inert. It's almost like you're dead, right? Because you're fully satisfied and you're fully complete. You have no want, no vulnerability, no desire. Living forever in the Christian sense to me feels like, yeah, you have no desire, no vulnerability, nothing to accomplish, nothing to do. That's death. That's death. Do I want that? Nah, I'm good. I don't want to exist in that conscious state. And also, I don't even know what it's like to exist in that conscious state because it's such a qualitative metaphysical change that I don't think that people can honestly say they know what it means to live forever or can even imagine what it would be like. And if you just give me one more second, I'll explain that. As human beings, we're born in a way that we didn't choose. Like I didn't choose to come here. My the little daughter I have, she didn't choose this. She just emerged into the world. So as humans, we emerge into the world and we didn't choose it. And then we grow up and we're aware of ourselves and we're aware of others and we're aware of our impending death. It's a weird way to exist. I didn't choose to be here. And now I'm really aware of you and myself and the fact that I'm going to die someday. And the fact that I'm going to die someday is like the closest, most intimate part of who I am. You know why? Because it delineates, it constitutes, it determines every second of my life. Well, I better take advantage of these years, this day, this moment, this opportunity, because I may not have it again. I should take that trip to Paris. I should go on that excursion to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. I should go spend time with my grandmother because she may not be here, right? Determined by temporality. So your death is the closest thing to you. It determines everything. And yet your death is something you'll never know because when you die, you won't be here to know it. And it's something you'll never experience because when you die, you won't be here to experience it. In some ways, it's unknowable and inexperienceable. It's the furthest thing from you. So as a human being, I'm constituted by this thing that is so intimate to me that it determines my every breath and so far from me that I'll never know or experience it. That's what it means to be a mortal temporal being, aware of himself, herself, aware of others, and aware of his or her or their mortality. So for me to like even imagine a state where I don't exist like that, I don't actually think I can. And I think it's dishonest to say that you could.
Yeah. Understood. That's fascinating the way you put that. And I've had some other people to challenge me because I've said to that question that I actually would want to live forever. And I still honestly grieve it pretty heavily.
Sure.
But I had another interviewer talk about just you can't grasp the idea of eternity and just how bored you'd eventually get. Like you'd beg to die eventually. But
yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
I was curious with your journey. You obviously have remarried and you have children. How is your journey out of Christianity? How did that change the way that you parent?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my partner now has never known me as an evangelical. They've never known me, so when I talk about that part of my life, they're like, I met you when you were, I would have never known that was who you were, a minister and the whole thing. And so that's an interesting dynamic because in my marriage, there's this whole history that this person doesn't know about. As a parent, I think what it means for me is this. I want my kids to search, to investigate, to be as curious and have as much wanderlust as possible. But what I'm always going to shield them away, shield is the wrong word. What I'm always going to discourage them from are absolute answers to life's most fundamental questions. To me, as a parent, the virtue that is most important is having the resilience and the willingness to face the vulnerability of being human without trying to close the circle. So I know that they're going to come home at some point in their lives, whether they're 12 or 15 or 17, and they're going to have ideas that are different than mine. They are, and it's going to happen. And we're going to butt heads at the dinner table. And my concern is not that they'll get off on some political ideology that doesn't match mine exactly. My concern will always be that they think that something can solve them. The way I just talked about the human condition, in my view, the human condition is incurable. We cannot be cured from the human condition. Religion tries to do that in many cases, not all. Religion tries to cure, right? When I went to church at age 14, forgiveness, prayer, relationship with God, you're cured. You'll live forever. You won't hurt anymore. There will be no more pain. You're cured, right? The overriding idea for me now is being human means so many things, but we cannot cure that condition. So if my kids want to explore anything from Hinduism to Marxism to, the ideas of the founding fathers of the American Revolution, Greek philosophy, you name it. Let's do it. Let's investigate. Let's read. Let's learn. But please, please, please don't think this will solve you. Because when people think things will solve them, that is when they turn into extremists and zealots and radicals. That's when your kid comes home at age 18 and is like, I'm converting to this because it'll cure me. So I'm going to go off into this like really radical community and give everything to my life to this thing. I'm going to sever ties with you, my parents, because you don't agree with me. I'm going to leave my social situation. I'm going to change my career, all because this will heal me. This will cure me once and for all. That's my biggest thing that I will do everything I can to instill in my kids. Life is hard. Life hurts. And it is so tempting when we are anxious and in pain and worried about the future to run to something we think will solve us. And I just want to encourage you, don't do that, right? Because it won't. It will not solve you. It will not cure you. And in fact, it'll end up hurting you more than anything it offers. And so that's my overriding philosophy as a parent when it comes to big questions about the things we're talking about today.
I love it. Well, very well said. I was curious, since you have left Christianity, how have Christians since then? I know you've talked a little bit about the grocery store kind of environment, but how have Christians overall responded to you, and have any of them tried to win you back? And do you have any evangelicals that have come, students in your classes that try to have a private conversation and talk about the gospel with you? And just, is there any sense that you've been, ostracized by Christians for what you've done?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've been ostracized. Yes. Short answer, yes. So I have had a few students kind of go down that road in class or other ways. And, I teach classes in my career. I've taught classes called Modern Christianity, Christian Ethics. I'm equipped to teach these things. And so, I've taught classes called God, Sex, and Love, just about gender and sexuality and Christianity. So eventually, you get students in those classes that they took the class because they thought it was Sunday school, and it's not. Look out. And a lot of the things you're talking about are actually kind of a shock to their system, and they want to push back. And the problem for them, and I tell them that, is that, look, I've spent 20 years, like I have 5 degrees. I'm not bragging. That's not a brag. I did way too much school. No one needs 5 degrees. It's like when you have coffee in the morning and that first cup feels really good and you're like, oh, caffeine. All right, I'm feeling good. Second cup. All right, I'm feeling really good. That third cup, you're like jittery and shaking. It didn't actually do anything. That's what 5 degrees is. It's like 2 degrees too many, right? But I tell them I have 5 degrees in this stuff. I've spent my life thinking about the church fathers, medieval mystics, women in the church, modern mainline Christianity. That's all I think about all day. And the other part is I was an evangelical for 11 years. I'm fluent in evangelical. I'm fluent in it. You want to talk, what do you want to do? You want to talk about Sermon on the Mount? You want to tell me gay people are not okay because of Sodom and Gomorrah? You want to tell me about what? Proverbs 31 and a godly woman? You want to talk about God created two genders in Genesis 1? I mean, come on, let's do it, buddy. Like, are you serious? Do you know how many times I have like encountered this stuff and thought about it myself? So it's not a fair fight with that 18-year-old who just came into college and is like, hey, I'm going to challenge the professor, right? Now, the other place this has happened is like on social media. All those folks from my old life are like, I'm going to tell Brad a piece of my mind because he's out here espousing things I don't agree with. And, you know, the hard part for me is like, I'm just not somebody who's good at backing down from that kind of debate. So there were years in there, right? 2012, 2013, where, you know, I would wake up and just go to battle. Like, there's no way you're going to win here when it comes to telling me about why this political candidate is actually the Christian candidate or, you know, whatever else, right? Most of those people realized they were never going to get to me. And, you know, I don't hang out on Facebook much anymore, so I don't have those conversations. But if you wanted to know why did I start my podcast in 2018, it's because it felt like such a more productive way to do this. All right, I'm gonna do long form podcasts where I delve into these topics, decode a lot of the evangelical language, debunk a lot of the talking points, and not do it in a way that I'm moaning and whining, but in an academic, well thought out manner. And it feels so much more productive now because sometimes people listen and they disagree. That's fine. But a lot more people are like, hey, you really helped me. I am now deconstructing my faith. I am now thinking through what my life should look like. Should I be a Christian? Should I not be a Christian? You guys have really helped me put all of that in context. So, you know, a lot of ostracization. There's a lot of people still that like ask my parents at church, like, what's Brad's problem? And I'm like, guys, I left that church in 2005. Get over it. What's wrong? Get over it. It's been 18 years, right? But, you know, there's still people that are just like, they can't let it go. And so, yeah, when I go to my hometown, I fully expect to get a bad look at the coffee shop or to have somebody kind of, you know, have a sly comment for me.
Yeah, I'll bet. Have you had anybody come to you that's just been like it's personally affected them really positively, just, you know, especially maybe someone who was you know, a Christian but was maybe gay in church, had to keep it quiet for whatever reason and just be like, you know what, I felt like everybody was against me. I felt like I had to be, you know, completely quiet about this. But, you know, hearing you being affirming, hearing you talk about your journey, like you literally were like a lifesaver, you know, where you helped me move, you know, to a safe place. Have you had any people talk about how you've affected them positively?
Oh, so many. And that's why if you said, why do you keep doing the podcast? You know, we do the podcast 3 days a week. We do a weekly roundup. We do on Fridays, we do on Wednesdays, it's in the code. So we take like a saying, like hate the sin, love the sinner, right? And we'll just do, what the hell does that mean, right? And we just do 25 minutes on what it means and why it's hurtful. And on Mondays, I do interviews with authors and other people. And a lot of folks have asked me, like, well, you guys do a lot. Why do you do that? And I'm like, to help people, because people email me, they text me, they DM me and say, thank you. I feel crazy. I feel like I'm the one in my church or my community that is like the outlier. Nobody will listen to me and nobody will like allow me to ask these questions. And you guys are really helping me do that. And it's not just strangers. There have been dozens of kids from my old youth group that are like, thank you. You know, you left the church. You were really open about your new life and your new beliefs. A lot of people were mad at you about it, but I followed your path 3 years later. I followed your path 5 years later. You gave me the language to tell my parents why I'm no longer part of that. You gave me the language to say, yep, I think I'm done, or I want to move into progressive Christianity or something else. I mean, the thing that the line that means the most to me, that's one of them told me, and I'll never forget, is I was at an event giving a talk and they came up to me and we were so happy to see each other. We were hugging and the whole thing. And they said, you know, I've listened to your podcast for years now. I've read your book and it's like you're my youth pastor again. But this time you're helping me understand everything that was toxic and wrongheaded about the faith that we inherited, rather than somebody trying to teach me that. And I'll always be, and that was so healing for me, because I have laid awake at night so many times feeling guilty about what I taught 13 and 14 and 15-year-old kids. And so that has been a huge balm on those wounds. and it also has encouraged me to keep going and keep doing the work I do.
I would ditto that as well. It's very much the guilt factor of all the preaching, especially of the hardcore, you're going to burn in hell if you don't believe like me kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's hard.
Well, I know you just mentioned your podcast. I just want to mention to everyone again, it's called Straight White American Jesus. I'll have the link beneath our video for that. Before we wrap up, maybe a preface for a follow-up interview. I'd love to chat with you again down the line, but I know we're short on time today. But could you just tell us a little bit about your book and what that's all about, and just what your concerns were, what prompted you to write it in the first place?
Yeah, so my book is called Preparing for War, and it really is kind of two things at once. It's a history of white Christian nationalism since the 1960s, and it's really trying to show folks, whether they're ex-Christians, whether they're just interested people, that January 6th was not an accident, that there's a history that preceded it. And if you study that history, you could kind of see why, as my colleague Andrew Whitehead says, January 6th makes kind of a tragic sense. So I want people to see the history behind January 6th, but I use my own journey as a way to tell that story. So it's part memoir and a lot of history. There's a lot of books out there that are like a memoir about leaving church, and those are great books. There's a lot of books that are like written by journalists who were never evangelical about evangelicalism. This book is both. It's a memoir about my experience, but it's also a history that I think is a deep dive into white Christian nationalism and its attacks on our democracy.
Could I ask you just before we wrap up to address one quick thought? I was listening to one of your other interviews, and you were talking about a quote from Jim Dobson about something like teenagers are the foot soldiers in the Second Civil War. And I talk a lot on this platform about, how Christians definitely want to get children while they're young. Yeah. We're trying to make little soldiers for Jesus. Obviously we want them first to love Jesus, but then to do something major in this world. The way you talked about, making a difference for people. Now that you're deconverted, I would agree. And I kind of phrase like, I want to, leave this planet better than we found it. But they're saying that same thing. We want to leave this planet better than we found it for Jesus, for the kingdom. Yeah. Why are young people and teenagers so important in this? And what do you see as some of the ways that they're trying to make a difference there? And what would you say is anything we could be thinking about and preparing for to try to fight that culture war?
Well, I just think that if you look at the chapter in the book on this, Dobson is really saying, it's not only that young people are the future of the church. All right, that makes sense. And look, I get it. You're a religious community. You think that having teenagers as the next generation is important. Okay, fine, whatever. I'm not part of your community. I don't agree with a lot of what your community believes or says, but I get what you mean there. Dobson is really saying pure Christian teenagers are the future of saving America, right? That's Christian nationalism. Christianity and the youth will save America from sinful ruin. That's Christian nationalism. Okay. And so I think what's important for me is just to recognize that their goal is to form children in such a way that they will carry out Christian families, Christian voting patterns, Christian understandings of politics and political opponents and others in a way that will save America. Okay. And that means excluding gay folks. That means excluding, right, LGBT folks. That means having really hardline policies that are in many ways cruel on immigration, on healthcare, on so many other fronts. So I think what we're seeing on the whole is that Gen Z is not happy with that idea, that they see through the rhetoric, that they're voting in big numbers for reproductive rights, for gun control. Okay. So yeah, I mean, young people are a big part of what's going to happen in this country over the next 20, 30, 40 years. But I also want to just warn us to not think that the young people will save us. Right. I hear that a lot, from folks my age or older. And it's not that I don't have faith in Gen Z. I do. But people have been saying the young people will save us. How long? Oh, yeah. Their parents are racist, but their kids they know better. Their parents are Christian nationalists, but their kids will know better. Christians are really good at replicating themselves in fundamentalist communities, and they're not always successful, but they are partially. And I think we need to reckon with that we can't just think, well, just because you're young, you will figure it out. There's a lot more work to it than that. And so I'm not for indoctrination. I'm not for fundamentalism. I'm not for extremism. What I am for is offering young people, right, a way of learning and exploring and understanding the world that they can come to conclusions on their own that are hopefully evidence-based, data-driven, right, based in history, and based in a vision for the world that is inclusive rather than exclusive.
I love it. I would just add one last thought to it. As I've done a lot of investigation into some Christian nationalism, and I've got a lot I still need to learn, but I've studied groups such as a lot about Doug Wilson out in Idaho, if you're familiar with him. And you get the sense that some of these groups are very well organized and probably very well funded. And I think that's where there's a scary side of this. I think we all need to be more educated on and do our best to, keep up with what's going on and try our best to, make a difference in this culture. But I know that's maybe we could table that for the next conversation, but I have so many things I'd love to get into with you on the book, and I still need to read it. So maybe I can read it and then reach out to you again and do a follow-up at some point. But was there anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, the whole last chapter of the book is on Idaho and Doug Wilson. So
really,
yeah. So that is there, and so folks want to know what's next. That chapter really foreshadows, I think, what's next.
Awesome. I'll be reading that shortly.
Yeah, awesome.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We've been speaking with Brad Onishi. Brad, thank you so much. It's great to hear you today. Great to hear your story, and thank you so much for what you're doing for the community.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Bye-bye.